Welcome to Wayne County Connection. I'm your host, Michael Sweigart, at the magnificent Model T Ford Club Museum in Wayne County, Indiana. Let's go inside and learn more about this wonderful facility. Thanks for joining me again as we promote Wayne County as a great place to work, live, and play. Today we are at the Model T Ford Club of America and the Model T Museum here in wonderful Wayne County, Indiana. We encourage you to do your part to get connected to make Wayne County a great place to work, live, and play. And you can do that by starting at the Model T Ford Club of America Museum. We're going to find out more about that today. Joining me first on the program today is Rachel Hughes, and she is the Executive Director here of the Model T Ford Club of America. Rachel, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
It is great to have you today. We have talked on air previous to the taping about how we're planning on doing 2 episodes, and we're going to learn a lot about the Model T Ford Club and the museum. They're not the same, but they're closely related. It's the same kind of thing. But for those 1 or 2 viewers out there who may not know you yet, how about if we start with getting a brief background about who you are and finally how you got to be here at the Model T Ford Club?
Well, I'm not native to Wayne County, but I feel like I am because I've been here 30 years. And I moved here to take a job with the United Way of the Whitewater Valley. And that job I held for about 13 years. Then I went to work for the Wayne County Community Foundation for a few years. And following that, I just wasn't sure what I wanted to do for a time. And the job came open here at the Model T Ford Club of America. And it just seemed like a really good fit for me because my husband and I volunteered with the Centennial back in 2008. And shortly after that, we bought our Model T. So we have been involved with the Model T community since 2009. And I love working with people and making connections, and that is a great deal of what this job entails. We have members all over the world, and so it's a lot of fun just making those connections and talking with people and never knowing who's going to answer, be on the other end of the phone when you pick it up.
Right. So you, getting back to you just a little bit, came to Wayne County for job and family about 30 years ago and have been here ever since. And we know because of your involvement with the United Way and the foundation that you've made a lot of connections throughout Wayne County. And then, as we'll talk about a little bit later here, the 2008 Centennial that really brought the Model T to the awareness of Wayne County and Richmond area, and you got involved a little bit there, but then transitioned. Your involvement got a little bit deeper until you end up working here and developing some more of those connections. For those viewers who are like, yeah, why Richmond? You know, how did it end up here? Let's go back to the beginnings of the Model T Ford Club of America and have you walk us through a little bit about that history and how we got here and go through the first couple of decades, I guess.
One of the most common questions we get asked when folks come to visit the museum is, why Richmond? And it is kind of unusual to have a Model T museum in Richmond, Indiana.
Yeah, you'd think Dearborn, Michigan, or maybe even Detroit.
Exactly. Well, it all started, let me back up and tell you how the club got started, because they're 2 separate entities, as you said, that are tied together. So the Model T Ford Club of America started back in 1965. We've been around a long time, and it is a membership organization. Currently, we have close to 5,000 members, and we'll talk about that more a little bit later. But it was started by a group of folks who were engaged with a group, a chapter in California, and they felt like it needed to be more than just a local group. They felt like it needed to be more national, more recognized in the entire United States. And their entire chapter wasn't in agreement about that. So a group of 6 of them met one evening and they said, let's do this. Let's start a national organization. And they did. And that is what grew into the Model T Ford Club of America as we know it today. So that grew and grew and grew to the group that we are today. And how we got to Richmond is kind of a coming home story. Jay Clayfoth, who unfortunately passed away a few years ago, was from this area. And he was an executive with Ford and had always loved Fords and Model T, and he had his own Model Ts. And he felt that it was really a shame that he was the only one that got to enjoy them. So he opened a small Model T museum over by Warm Glow. Those of you in the community will know that's just a few miles from here, with his own collection. And when Warm Glow decided they were expanding, they needed that space. So we were fortunate enough to find the building that most people think is the Model T Museum. And in fact, that's one of 2 buildings that we have that house our collection today. So that actually started, I got to look at my notes to make sure I get this right, in 2007 at Warm Glow. Then in 2012, we moved into the one building here in Richmond. And that's when Jay really started expanding the collection. From there, we bought another building and expanded even more. But that's how we ended up in Richmond, Indiana. It was Jay wanting to come home, wanting to come back to his roots. And so that's why we're not in Detroit.
So just to kind of recap there and hit some things, there was a club of Model T aficionados out in Southern California, and a few of them thought, hey, there are other clubs like us, but we should have an organization to kind of coordinate and grow this and be able to share information and so forth. And so they formed an organization that became the Model T Ford Club of America. And you've really developed as kind of a clearinghouse and I guess a coordinator of the clubs around not only the United States, but now internationally.
Yes.
And have clubs, the charter clubs of the Model T Ford Club of America in other countries, even on other continents around the world. And that's really exciting. I want to talk a little bit more about some of those clubs and how that's affected us. But going back to the history there, so Jay was the director of the association and brought it all back with him, the headquarters as it was, with him when he moved back to Wayne County, and then started sharing that, as seems to be a theme in Model T Ford Club, about sharing the vehicles and the passion with others. We'll talk a little bit later. I'm going to foreshadow here with the Rosenthal, dropping a little bit of name there, so pay attention to that. Sharing and just building on that joy. So we've talked a little bit about the background. Are there any of the vehicles in the museum now that are part of that original collection that are still in the permanent collection here, or other notables that we want to highlight to start with?
Well, one of my favorites that is sitting right in front of us that I'm sure we're going to be showing some film of as we speak is the fire truck. And I'm going to let Micaela tell you some details about that, but it's one of my favorite because of the way it was restored. It is a beautiful vehicle, but it was so lovingly restored with gold leaf trim and just the history behind it.
Well, I'm excited to learn more about that history, and you mentioned Micaela, so why don't we have her come and tell us a little bit about herself and the fire truck.
Absolutely.
So Micaela, before we get started with talking about the truck that Rachel has kind of dumped in your lap there, we do want to give you an opportunity to get to know our viewers, and our viewers a chance to know you, because I'm sure that most of them don't know who you are. Micaela Knox is the Museum and Education Coordinator, soon to be Associate Museum Director.
That's absolutely right. I am kind of new to the museum world altogether. I recently graduated with a bachelor's from Ball State. I currently live in Muncie and am now pursuing a certificate in museum studies from IU Indy. So that kind of begs the question of why I'm here in Richmond right now.
Well, we know why you're here, because this is a great place to work, live, and play.
That's absolutely right. I commute all the way down to Richmond mostly because the Model T Museum brought me here. I wasn't finding a lot of good opportunities for museums up in Muncie. There's plenty of, jobs that need fulfilling, and I've lost my thread.
Well, it seems like you've made a good fit here at the museum. I do have some interaction with the museum myself outside of the program, and I've seen how you've kind of gotten in here and already put your mark on the museum and brought it to a new level. So I'm excited to hear more about that. Before we get into what you're doing here, though, thanks for telling us a little bit about yourself. But talk about this truck over here that Rachel was telling us about, this 1925 fire truck.
Yeah, this 1925 fire truck came to the museum from the very beginning in 2007. It kind of has an interesting story because it was donated to us from a family who wanted to use the fire truck as an opportunity to educate folks about how teas were modified. The fire truck is originally from Annandale, and we were talking about Jay Clayfoth. Jay was also an editor for the Vintage Ford, which is a publication put out by the Model T Ford Club, and he talked about how he was about to put through an advertisement someone had put into the Vintage Ford looking for their fire truck that they used to own from Annandale, New Jersey. And Jay talked about how he knew exactly where it was and called up that person immediately to tell them that it was part of our museum collection here.
That's really interesting. And so this was a family-owned vehicle that then got out of the family somehow. Rachel was saying a little bit about the immaculate restoration that occurred, and then it ended up back in the museum.
That's absolutely right. So it was sold to auction, but the man was curious about where it went. He was trying to hunt it down, and throughout its life, it's just seen a lot of different owners and seen a lot of different action throughout, acting in fires and whatnot from Annandale and forward.
Yeah. So you mentioned, as you were describing the truck itself, that how they were modified, how the Model Ts were modified. And one of the questions that I always have is, aren't they just old cars?
They are definitely old cars, but they're not what people think they are. Especially when you come into the museum, you get to see the variety and the pizzazz that's behind the Model T altogether. A lot of people come in and they think that a Model T is a simple black, old antique car. But when you come in here, the very first Model T that you see is bright red in color. It is, we have two 1909 Model T Tourings. Both of them are painted in such a beautiful carmine red. And that kind of really speaks for the fact that the Model T is just a colorful car altogether, but both between its original history and then the legacy that it leaves afterwards.
So a lot of people think of Model T as the first mass-produced car. We're familiar with the story of Henry Ford and the assembly line and how he wanted to make the car affordable and wanted to make some profit out of it as well, but also put it into the hands of everyday American and paid his employees enough so that they could afford to buy them as well. Because we all know then and now that word-of-mouth advertising is the most effective, and your neighbor's recommendation is more valuable than a sales pitch.
That's absolutely right.
From somewhere. And all of that took place in the growth and development of the Model T. And it wasn't, as the Model T, we know that it wasn't the first Ford that came out, nor was it the last, but it was the first really well-known and ubiquitous vehicle on the road. And there's the famous line that we don't actually, I think, have attribution for, that you could have it in any color you want as long as it's black. It's kind of a misnomer. As you pointed out, some of the original Model Ts in 1909 that you have in stock are red, and there were a lot of colorful cars. So we're sitting in front of a beautiful black version right now, but it also shows the elegance of the vehicle.
This one is an interesting one. It's a 1912 town car, and it's painted in such a dark blue that it's kind of difficult to see in our current museum gallery lighting. It wasn't until 1914 when Henry Ford finally implemented that mass production that you talked about in his plants that they started to paint everything that black color. But before then, since they were taking so much time to assemble the car, they figured, why not paint it?
Mm-hmm. And there's a lot on this vehicle and other vehicles around the museum, a lot of brass showing. And that probably, to me, it attests to the, the beauty of the vehicle, also the amount of craftsmanship and work that went into the production of the vehicles. I'm sure that you have some information here at the museum where viewers could come and learn some more about that.
Yeah, absolutely. Right now we're sitting in one of our gallery spaces. We have on exhibit a full line of vehicles showing us the development of the car, specifically between 1909 to 1925. But you get to see the evolution of the Model T. To folks with a little bit of an untrained eye, out and about, if you see a Model T driving, you might not be able to tell what year it is, but when you get to see it here in the museum along this exhibit lineup, you get to see exactly how beautiful every car is for what it is.
I kind of jumped out of the prep that I did with you, and we got into some specifics with the Model T Ford. Let's go back. You mentioned we're in one room of the Model T Ford Museum. Tell us a little bit more about how big the museum actually is.
The museum altogether is a campus containing 2 buildings. We are separated by North 8th Street, but altogether it's a very connected story that we have. We start off with this main building. You enter in, and the first exhibit that you see is Ford's first 30 years. A brief overview of Henry Ford and the Ford Motor Company, starting off with Henry Ford's quadricycle, ending with the 1926 Model T. And then after that, you enter another gallery space, and that connects us with the exhibit of development that I just mentioned, along with a really good exhibit of fire trucks, including that 1925 that we talked about. When we're across the street in our agency building, that one is a lot more immersive, and we are a lot more hands-on over there. We have a vintage agency showroom in which we showcase some of our prettier cars, along with a Farming Fords exhibit with Fords and tractors and Model T modifications. After that, we have a working garage in which Model T Ford Club of America members can come in and work on their cars upon request. And then after that, we have an exhibit space of a lot more variations of Model T modifications.
And then it ends in the gift shop, and we'll be ending our tour there again when we get there tomorrow.
That's absolutely right.
I would like to go back to Rachel and get into more of that development of the history of the club and the museum. And so we'll go back and talk to Rachel and ask her to tell us a little bit more about how the museum has expanded over time. We've heard what it looks like now. Let's talk about what's gone on in the meantime. So Rachel, I said I put you back in the hot seat here. We're talking with Micaela, and she mentioned some of how the museum has grown and how it's expanded over time, but I'd like to give you an opportunity as the executive director of the Model T Ford Club of America to talk about how the club and the museum have grown in the latter part of its existence here in the last few years since you came into a permanent space here in Wayne County.
Well, I think we briefly touched on a little bit of that when we were talking about the growth in outside of the United States.
Right.
When it started, the chapters were all located in the U.S. But now, I'm going to look at my notes again here so I don't get it wrong. We currently have 119 chapters in the United States. But what I don't think most people realize is that we're an international organization. So we have 15 chapters located outside of the United States in places like Puerto Rico, Germany, Australia, Austria, Japan even. We have folks in Japan that have Model Ts. It's amazing to me. I recently went to a World Forum for museum executives, motor museums. And as I got to know folks, they would see my sweatshirt and they say, "Oh, Model T Museum, we have a Model T in our collection." Almost without fail, every museum there had at least one Model T in their collection. And I found that so fascinating because to me it just really drove home the point of how important this vehicle has been to automotive history and to the world.
I was going to say, and then to world history.
World history.
Which makes its value here in Wayne County almost immeasurable.
Yes.
Immeasurable. You mentioned something that I wanted to pick up on. You talked about the connection with Australia, and for people from the area who may have paid attention, earlier we also mentioned the centennial celebration in 2008, and I try never to put my guests on a spot, but I did once, very shortly after we started the show, in one of the first episodes. It was right after the centennial, and we were wrapping up with the Model T Ford Club and Jay Clayfoth, and I said, so Jay, you've just had hundreds of Model Ts here in Wayne County. When are you bringing them back? He said, in 100 years. But thankfully, that's not the case. One of the things that we've seen as the museum has grown and the club has grown is bringing the Ts back to Wayne County on an almost annual basis. You started a homecoming a couple of years ago, which really impacts Wayne County in a lot of ways. So one of the things that you brought was that Australian, I think it was called the Winkler Special. It was a speedster that was out of Australia that they brought all the way to Wayne County.
Yes. We've had many amazing cars that have come, and it just always surprises me at how willing Model T owners are to share their vehicles. That was one example. We had the Silver Streak. What an amazing story. This was a group of girls at a time when women didn't drive, let alone take off by themselves. They would pile in this Model T and just go off for adventures, drive hundreds of miles. They actually met Henry Ford, and he signed their car. And just the amazing stories behind these cars. And the folks that are so willing to share them and to loan them to us. The car that we're sitting in front of is on loan to us. Mm-hmm. Can you imagine just loaning this beautiful vehicle to someone and saying, share this?
Right.
Share this with people. So we're very fortunate to own a lot of our vehicles, but also to be able to share someone's vehicle for a period of time.
And earlier you mentioned Jay Clayfoth and his desire to share and that other people should see these. And so really with the establishment of the museum, it took the interest beyond the clubs and the aficionados to give everyone an opportunity to see a wide collection of them all in one place. Because it's one thing for them to go to a motor museum and see a Model T sitting there or a couple of versions, but to see the entire history, as Micaela was saying, from 1909 to 1925 in one showroom is a unique experience for visitors.
And we are truly the only museum that is solely dedicated to the Model T. Mm-hmm. As I said, a lot of the museums that I met at that World Forum had a Model T or 6 Model Ts. But we're the only ones solely dedicated to the history of the Model T in the world. And we're right here in Richmond.
We are right here in Richmond, right here in Wayne County, East Central Indiana, and there's no better place to be to see Model Ts. One of the things that we mentioned earlier that I wanted to ask about was the special acquisitions. And you have some really unique vehicles here. We're going to see later something called the Purple Cow, I think maybe, and something. But there's another unique exhibit showing it's hanging from the ceiling. You want to highlight that for us, and then we'll get Micaela to give us some details about it.
I would love to. We have several friends that fly biplanes. I've ridden in them, and I was a little terrified, you know. You're just out there in the open. But what you're talking about is a Pete and Pole airplane with a Model T engine. Now, when we go out and drive our 1924 Roadster, it stalls, it stops, you sit there. If you're in an airplane and it stops, what happens, Michael?
Yeah, it drops.
Right. So I don't know if I'd be brave enough to fly in this, but part of our collection includes a Pete and Pole airplane with a Model T engine, and we're very proud to have it. It was donated to us and has been part of our collection for quite a while now, and it's very unique to have this. I've heard that there are others that have a Model A engine, but this must be pretty rare to have a Model T engine in it. And we have a picture of it flying, so somebody was braver than me. So
Well, Rachel, it's been an honor to have you on the program this month, and we're going to continue talking to you next month as we continue our visit here at the Model T Ford Club of America and Model T Ford Club Museum. But we're going to ask Micaela to come back and tell us a little bit more detail about the Pete and Pole and other exhibits here at the museum. We'll talk to you more next month. So, Micaela, Rachel was just mentioning this Pete and Pole airplane behind us, and I want to give you, as the museum director, a few more minutes to talk about that and what our viewers can see if they come to the program.
So, as soon as you walk through the front door of the main building, immediately if you look up, you start to see the wings of an airplane right over your head. As you enter into our second gallery, you see this Pete and Pole Sky Scout. It is number one, serial number one out of the Pete and Pole lineup for this interesting, very limited run plane series. Folks up in Minnesota, Wisconsin area, Oshkosh, really know Pete and Pole, and it's interesting to see this one here in Richmond. It was donated to us in 2012 when we expanded to this building. And what's interesting about it is that it has a Model T engine inside of it. You don't see too many of those altogether.
Yeah. So we will encourage you to come and visit the museum and see that. Micaela Knox, the Associate Museum Director, we'll use your new title, and congratulate you on your growth here. You. And thank you for showing us, and encourage our viewers to come and get a tour and see not only the vehicles that we've talked about, but the ones that we haven't even mentioned yet, because there are a lot of them. You're missing out if you haven't been here yet. We've run out of time here at the Model T Ford Club of America for this episode, but join us next month as we'll continue talking about the museum and the club and what it means to Wayne County, Indiana, and the world. I'm Michael Sweigart, your host. On behalf of our producer, Jenny Lahman, our director, Wes Miller, all the staff at Whitewater Community Television, I encourage you to get connected in Wayne County and make it a great place to work, live, and play. We'll see you next month. Fiesta